He is an Indigenous geographer and environmental management scholar at Wilfrid Laurier University, deeply rooted in his Huron-Wendat traditions and community. He sees his purpose as a cultural translator between two worlds, Western and Indigenous, that have historically struggled to meaningfully communicate. He is keenly aware of the need for deeper reconciliation between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous intellectual communities through the creation of mutually usable channels, communication, and research collaborations. Thank you so much, Dr. Miguel, for being here. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. and Hi, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on the value of Indigenous stewardship in a changing world. And I have to say up front that I was called on to replace Esther Yazzie-Lewis on short notice, so I'm sure her presentation would have been much more insightful, more directly related to some of the core themes and topics, but I'll do my best to tie my research into these kinds of questions and our collective effort here. So a little bit about me and my background. I'm an Indigenous geographer. I belong to the Huron-Wendat First Nation, and I've done work on Indigenous stewardship and environmental management, and really in my view, the potential that Indigenous knowledge systems and perspectives have in terms of re-envisioning and renegotiating our role as human beings in relation to ecological systems, or nature, if you will. And so today I want to guide you through some of the foundational principles of Indigenous knowledge in contrast with Western extractive models, and also how Indigenous-led conservation initiatives can provide perhaps more sustainable and reciprocal alternatives. And my journey in academic research has brought me to places like the Yucatan in Mexico and Eastern Canada, the Canadian subarctic more recently, and even more recently the Sami territories in northern Finland, where I've witnessed firsthand the impact of some of these approaches that I'll be discussing with you today. So I'd like to delve into some of the foundational concepts that inform my work and research, such as Indigenous knowledge and responsibility-based thinking, which are very, I believe, central to understanding Indigenous perspectives of environmental stewardship. So I'll offer a primer here, just a summary, in terms of these concepts. So Indigenous knowledge is not just a set of traditional practices. It's a holistic worldview that emphasizes interconnectedness of all living things, and it views features of landscapes and the land, water, animals, plants, and even the elements as having intrinsic value and agency. So this worldview fosters a deep sense of responsibility to maintain both balance and reciprocity with the environment, rather than simply extracting resources for human use. So unlike Western perspectives and dominant narratives that often prioritize individual rights, collective rights, for instance, Indigenous knowledge and responsibility-based thinking focus on the responsibilities that we have to each other and future generations and the natural world. So responsibility-based thinking, at least in my view, contrasts quite sharply with dominant rights-based frameworks that are found in most Western environmental management systems around the globe. And these systems often prioritize individual entitlements over collective duties. And so RBT calls for a shift in this mindset, and it emphasizes that our actions should be guided by a duty to maintain a respect for all living beings, including the land and ecosystems. And so this approach challenges us to move beyond exploitation and towards more sustainable and reciprocal relationships with the natural world. And I believe that understanding these differences is crucial because it's really how it frames, it frames how we approach conservation and environmental management as a whole. And by integrating some of these Indigenous perspectives that I'm sharing today, we can really begin to address the limitations of conventional approaches and foster more ethical and sustainable practices. So Indigenous knowledge emphasizes, as I mentioned, deep reciprocal and even familial relationships and interactions with the land, with, in the case of many First Nations in Canada and Indigenous groups around the world, the land being represented as a relative or even as a nurturing mother. So unlike Western perspectives that often view land primarily as a resource to be used or exploited, Indigenous knowledge systems see the land as a living entity with which human beings have a reciprocal relationship. And so this fosters necessarily a sense of responsibility to the land. Because if you love something, generally you feel a responsibility to it and a duty to act as well in a way that's respectful and mutually beneficial. So one of the core beliefs in Indigenous knowledge systems is in the agency of other than human beings, including animals, plants, and natural elements like rivers and mountains, and even the weather. And in many Indigenous cultures, these beings are seen as active participants in the world, often playing a critical role in maintaining the balance of ecosystems. So they have agency and, like I said, an active role within this broader decision-making process when it comes to land management. This belief stands in contrast really to extractionist logics that often objectify nature and reduce it to a set of resources to be managed or commodities to be traded. So RBT aligns closely with Indigenous perspectives and moves beyond a rights-based framework, as I've been mentioning, towards more of a system or really an operating system that's grounded in an ethical obligation to care for the land and other beings. So let me move towards the discussion on the colonial impact on Indigenous land stewardship and traditional governance structures and Indigenous resilience as well. So colonialism and colonial practices, as we all know, I'm sure, have disrupted traditional Indigenous land stewardship practices that had been in place for thousands of years in different parts of the world, definitely on the American continent here, meaning North and South America, before the arrival of Columbus in 1492. This included the imposition of Western land use models that prioritized resource extraction, often at the expense of environmental sustainability and Indigenous sovereignty. And so these actions led to land dispossession, environmental degradation, and the marginalization of Indigenous communities from the decision-making processes that affect their lands. So despite these challenges, Indigenous peoples and our knowledge systems have shown remarkable resilience. And Indigenous communities continue to practice their traditional stewardship, continue to adapt to new challenges like climate change, more recently, while maintaining a deep respect for the land and a reciprocal relationship with all beings on the land. So this resilience, this cultural resilience, is evident in the continued use of traditional ecological knowledge in different regions around the world, and cultural practices, and also community-led conservation efforts. So I think the challenge these days is to uphold and secure Indigenous rights and territories, and to continue to protect them from development and from incursion from the part of private interests and the forestry industry, mining, so on and so forth, and to facilitate, in doing so, Indigenous peoples and their ability to carry out their sacred and inextinguishable responsibilities and duties to the land. Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the world's population and manage over 80% of global biodiversity. So just that figure right there points to the importance of Indigenous peoples and our role in terms of global biodiversity protection and even climate change adaptation and mitigation. The Indigenous cultural survival, I believe, is not just about survival, the resilience is not just about survival. It's about thriving and reclaiming relationships and stewardship roles that are essential for the health of both the land and also the community. So by embracing these principles, we can work together collectively towards more inclusive, sustainable approaches to environmental governance, at least I believe. And so extractionism refers to the large-scale removal of natural resources, often for short-term economic gain, without the consideration of long-term health, whether it's the environment or human populations, and more broadly, the well-being of local communities. And so this approach is deeply rooted in colonial practices, and it's led to widespread environmental degradation in different parts of the world, including deforestation, water pollution, and overall biodiversity loss on a global level. And so for Indigenous peoples, extractionism has also meant the displacement from their traditional lands and the disruption of their stewardship practices that have sustained ecosystems for generations. Despite these challenges, Indigenous communities have shown, as I've been saying, incredible resilience, and many try, as best as they can, to uphold their stewardship traditions and to deal with new and emerging environmental conditions brought about by environmental change like climate change, and again, maintaining this deep sense of connection to the land. So in many ways, I think that Indigenous knowledge systems and perspectives on stewardship and narratives that counter Western extractionism, they can offer germane and really useful areas of exploration, in which to renegotiate the very terms of reference and whether development in certain instances is even needed or necessary, or whether there's other viable alternatives that can promote the long-term health and regenerative practices within communities. And all of that is part of a broader global effort as well to protect biodiversity and to deal with complex environmental challenges that we all face as human beings. So Indigenous land stewardship is not a passive interaction with the environment, but an active management practice that has been in place for millennia. Indigenous communities have traditionally used various management techniques, such as controlled burns, selective harvesting, and sustainable hunting practices, just to name a few, to maintain the health and the balance of their ecosystems. So these practices demonstrate a deep understanding of ecological processes and a commitment to maintaining the resilience and productivity of the land for many, many generations. So for example, controlled burns are used to prevent larger wildfires and promote the growth of native plant species and maintain habitats for wildlife. So those are some of the positive consequences or outcomes of smaller, more controlled burns. And this has been an Indigenous practice in places like Canada and Australia for millennia, really. So Indigenous land stewardship also involves careful monitoring and adapting to environmental changes on a real-time basis. And I think this is in part due to the fact that Indigenous knowledge systems are, generally speaking, at least in this part of the world, in the Americas, passed down orally through the generations. So it really allows for flexibility and adaptiveness and for responses to on-the-ground changes that happen in real time. For example, one of my research projects is in the Decho region of the Northwest Territories, where it's one of the most rapidly warming regions in the world. And so this has an impact on permafrost, and it's bringing about permafrost thaw at a very rapid rate. So Indigenous peoples there are having to contend with these changes on the land. As I said, basically on a real-time basis, these changes are, every time I go back, every few months, you can kind of see the changes that are happening on the land. So Indigenous communities have to be able to make informed decisions that promote ecological balance. And that's why this aspect of upholding Indigenous rights and securing and protecting Indigenous territories from development is so key in this regard. So in terms of the practical implications of integrating responsibility-based thinking and Indigenous knowledge into more mainstream or broader environmental governance and conservation strategies, I believe that by adopting some of these frameworks, we can fundamentally reshape our approach to managing natural resources and shifting from a focus on exploitation to one of stewardship and sustainability and responsibility. And so by integrating responsibility-based thinking and Indigenous knowledge into more mainstream environmental policies, we can create governance models that prioritize and encourage collective responsibility and reciprocity, and also that benefits the long-term ecological health. So this approach necessarily challenges conventional, often extractive methods and encourages us to consider our duties, really, to the environment and to future generations. There's significant opportunities for collaboration between Indigenous communities and conservation organizations and scientists, and even the private sector, and governments. I think that by using a two-eyed seeing approach where we look at a common challenge that we're faced with an Indigenous eye and a Western eye, and we're trying to make sense of all this data and information from those two perspectives, we can really bolster and enhance one another in practice. And that's been the case in my research for the last decade and a half in different regions across the Americas. So practical steps could include recognizing Indigenous land rights, supporting Indigenous-led conservation initiatives and guardians programs all over the world, and more importantly, building stronger partnerships based on respect and reciprocity. And by doing so, we not only enhance the effectiveness of conservation strategies, but also promote social equity and justice as well. So I encourage all of us to reflect on how we can integrate some of these principles into our work, whether through policy, practice, or partnerships. Embracing RBT and IK offers a pathway to more sustainable and equitable environmental management that benefits both people and the planet. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize the profound value of reconnecting with Indigenous ways of knowing that are more responsibility as opposed to rights-based, and Indigenous knowledge as well, and responsibility-based thinking that challenge us to rethink our relationship with the natural world. Again, moving away from exploitative and extractive practices towards more responsible and reciprocal and respectful ways of living. So I hope this presentation has highlighted, the importance of Indigenous stewardship and perhaps inspired you to consider these teachings and how they can inform your own work and your own daily life as well. So again, it was very brief summary, but you can reach me by email at msioui@wlu.ca if you have any further questions, because I will have to leave after this presentation. So thanks for your attention. And I look forward to possibly exploring some of these ideas further with you and amplifying this collective and essential message that I've tried to share today. Thank you.